In a world where women were meant to weave and bear children, one woman picked up a sword and rewrote the rules of an entire age. This is not a story whispered in shadows or debated in dusty academic halls. This is the saga of Lagertha, the greatest Shieldmaiden who ever lived. A warrior who commanded armies, a queen who ruled kingdoms, a woman who proved that strength has no gender and courage knows no bounds. From the frozen forests of Norway to the blood-soaked battlefields of Denmark, from a young girl defying her fate to a legendary ruler whose name still echoes through history over 1,000 years later. This is her story. This is the legend of Lagertha. A story of defiance, courage, and the unbreakable spirit of a woman who refused to accept the world's limitations. The year was approximately 780 AD, in the harsh and unforgiving lands of what would become Norway. The world was brutal, governed by the sword and the axe, where strength determined survival and weakness meant death. Winter could kill as easily as any enemy. Famine stalked the land regularly. Raiders from neighboring territories struck without warning. Into this world of constant danger and struggle, a girl child was born to a noble family in the region of Hlaðir, in what is now Trøndelag. Her name was Lagertha, and from the moment she drew her first breath, she was different. Not in any way that could be seen or measured, but in a fundamental quality of spirit that would shape not just her own destiny, but the destiny of Viking culture itself. Viking society, contrary to the popular belief perpetuated by medieval Christian chroniclers who viewed the Norse as barbaric pagans, was not entirely restrictive toward women. Norse women enjoyed rights and freedoms that their European counterparts would not see for centuries. They could own property in their own names, divorce their husbands if mistreated, inherit wealth from their families, run businesses, and even serve as religious leaders. A Viking woman was not chattel to be owned. She had legal standing, could testify in court, could demand compensation for injuries done to her. In many ways, Norse women in the 8th century had more legal rights than European women would have in the 18th century. But there were lines that were never crossed. Women did not fight in battles. Women did not lead warriors into combat. Women did not challenge men with weapons in hand and expect to survive the encounter. These were not mere suggestions or social conventions. These were boundaries written in blood and tradition, enforced by centuries of cultural practice and religious conviction. The Valkyries of legend might choose the slain on battlefields, might carry heroes to Valhalla, might even determine the outcome of wars. But mortal women stayed home. They managed households, raised children, worked the looms, tended the animals, brewed the ale, and waited for their men to return from raids and wars. This was the natural order, sanctified by custom and enforced by expectation. Lagertha's father was a jarl, a regional lord who commanded respect and loyalty from the warriors and farmers under his protection. He was known as a fair ruler, quick to reward loyalty, but equally quick to punish betrayal. Her mother came from a line of powerful women, known throughout Norway for their intelligence, political acumen, and the wise counsel they provided to their husbands. In Norse society, a clever wife was valued almost as much as a strong sword arm. The sagas are full of stories of wise women who guided their husbands' decisions, who prevented foolish wars or arranged profitable alliances. Lagertha's mother was such a woman, respected in her own right. But it was Lagertha's grandfather, a grizzled veteran of countless raids and battles, whose influence would prove most significant. He was old by Viking standards, having survived into his 60s through a combination of skill, luck, and an uncanny ability to read his opponents. His body bore the scars of a lifetime of combat. A sword cut across his face had taken his left eye. His right hand was missing 2 fingers, lost to a Danish axe. He walked with a limp from a spear wound that had never quite healed properly. But his mind remained sharp as any blade, and he saw something unusual in his young granddaughter. While other children played with dolls made of straw and cloth, Lagertha fashioned weapons from sticks and branches. While other girls learned to spin wool and weave cloth, essential skills for any Norse woman. She would sneak away to watch the warriors train in the yard, studying their movements with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She didn't just watch for entertainment. She was analyzing, learning, memorizing techniques and strategies. By the age of 7, she could describe in detail the proper stance for sword fighting, the optimal shield grip, the vulnerable points in a man's defenses. She had never been taught these things. She had simply observed and understood. Her grandfather, recognizing this unusual aptitude and perhaps seeing in her something of his own warrior spirit, made a decision that would have shocked most of his contemporaries. Against the protests of nearly everyone in the household, against the warnings that he was courting disaster and divine displeasure, he began teaching Lagertha the warrior's craft. Not openly, of course. To do so publicly would have invited mockery and condemnation. But in the forest clearings before dawn, in the hours when the world still slept and only the ravens witnessed their sessions, he taught her everything he knew. He started with the basics. How to hold a wooden sword properly, not just gripping it, but becoming one with it, making it an extension of her arm. How to move her feet, understanding that footwork was often more important than arm strength in combat. How to read an opponent's body language, to see the telltale signs of an impending attack in the shift of weight, the tightening of muscles, the direction of the eyes. He told her stories of the gods, particularly of Freya, the goddess who embodied the paradox Lagertha would come to represent. Freya was the goddess of love and beauty, associated with fertility and passion. But she was also a goddess of war, who rode into battle and claimed half the honored dead for her hall, Folkvanger. If the gods themselves embraced such contradictions, her grandfather argued, then perhaps mortal women could as well. But he taught her more than just physical techniques. He taught her that true combat mastery required understanding principles that transcended mere strength. He explained that fighting was not about muscles alone, but about leverage, timing, distance, and above all, psychology. A smaller fighter could defeat a larger one if they understood these principles and applied them correctly. A woman could defeat a man not by matching his strength, which would be foolish, but by being smarter, faster, more tactical. He drilled into her that every physical disadvantage could be turned into an advantage if approached correctly. He taught her to analyze opponents before the first blow was struck. Watch how they stand, he would instruct. Do they favor one leg? That suggests an old injury, a weakness to exploit. Do they grip their weapon too tightly? They're afraid or inexperienced, and fear makes people predictable. Do they make direct eye contact? They're testing you, looking for signs of fear or hesitation. He taught her that every fight truly began before weapons were drawn, in the subtle psychological warfare of positioning, posture, and presence. He taught her that if you could make your opponent doubt themselves before the fighting started, you had already won half the battle. He also taught her brutal truths that no other instructor would have shared with a young girl. He told her that as a woman warrior, she would face challenges that male warriors never would. Her opponents would underestimate her, which could be turned to her advantage if she was clever. But they would also target her specifically, seeing the defeat of a woman warrior as an achievement worth boasting about in the mead halls. She would need to be not just as good as male warriors, but decisively, undeniably better. There could be no close victories, no lucky strikes. She would need to win her fight so convincingly that no one could claim luck or circumstance played a role. Beyond physical training, her grandfather instilled in her a deep understanding of Norse culture, law, and the intricate web of relationships that governed their society. He explained the concept of honor, how in Viking society, reputation was more valuable than gold or land. A man's word, his oath, was sacred. To be known as an oath breaker was to be cast out from society, to become nothing. He taught her about the thing, the assembly where free men gathered to make decisions, settle disputes, and determine justice. He explained how power in their world flowed not just from strength of arms, but through complex networks of loyalty, obligation, family ties, and carefully maintained alliances. He taught her that a clever leader could turn enemies into allies, could transform apparent weakness into hidden strength, could win wars without fighting battles if they understood how to manipulate the social and political currents of their world. These lessons, perhaps more than the combat training, would define Lagertha's later success. She was learning to think not just as a warrior, but as a leader, a strategist, a political operator in a complex and dangerous world. The training continued in secret for years. Lagertha grew stronger, faster, more skilled. By the time she reached adolescence, she could defeat grown men in sparring, though always in secret, always where no one else would see. Her grandfather made her practice against multiple opponents, teaching her that real combat rarely involved fair one-on-one duels. He made her train when she was exhausted, teaching her that battles don't pause for tiredness. He made her fight in rain, in snow, in darkness, teaching her that enemies attack when conditions favor them, not when you're ready. But childhood lessons in secret forest clearings were one thing. The real world, with its expectations and social pressures, was quite another. As Lagertha grew into adolescence and then young womanhood, the pressure mounted for her to behave as a proper Norse woman should. She was beautiful, blessed with long golden hair that caught the sunlight, striking features that drew attention wherever she went, and a presence that commanded notice even when she tried to avoid it. This beauty, which in another woman might have been purely an asset, became for Lagertha both a blessing and a complication. Suitors began to appear at her father's hall, jarls and the sons of jarls, warriors who had distinguished themselves in battle, wealthy traders seeking to elevate their status through marriage into nobility. They came with gifts, with promises, with elaborate displays of their worth and status. They saw Lagertha as a prize to be won, a path to alliance with her father's house, a beautiful woman who would bear them sons and manage their households. Her father, while loving his daughter, also understood the political realities. A good marriage alliance could secure peace, create trading partnerships, strengthen his position against rivals. Her family expected her to choose, to evaluate the suitors, to select the one who offered the best combination of status, wealth, and prospects, to settle into the life that had been predetermined for her before she was born, to embrace her role as a Viking noblewoman, to produce heirs, to manage a household, to support her husband's ambitions. This was not considered oppression or limitation in their culture. This was simply the natural order of things, the role that women had played since time immemorial. She refused them all, every single one. The first few times, her family thought she was simply being selective, waiting for the right match. But as the refusals continued, as suitable match after suitable match was rejected, concern turned to confusion and then to alarm. When asked why she refused these men, many of whom were objectively excellent matches, she would look her questioners in the eye and say simply that she had other plans. What those plans were, she wouldn't elaborate. She couldn't, really, because she was planning something that didn't have a name in their language, something that had never been done before. She didn't want to be someone's wife, some man's prized possession, a vessel for producing the next generation. She wanted something that terrified her family precisely because they couldn't even imagine it. She wanted to be free. Free to choose her own path, to forge her own destiny, to be valued for her own achievements rather than her husband's status. This conflict came to a head when Lagertha was 16 years old. A neighboring jarl, a brutal man named Fru, had been pressuring her father for her hand in marriage. Fru was powerful, commanding significant territory and a large warband. He was also cruel, known for his treatment of enemies and even his own people. Women who caught his eye often disappeared into his household, never to be seen again. His previous 2 wives had both died under mysterious circumstances. But he was powerful, and in the brutal calculus of Viking politics, power often trumped morality. When diplomatic refusals failed to dissuade Fro, when gifts sent back unaccepted did not communicate the message clearly enough, he decided to take what he wanted by force. He arrived at Lagertha's father's hall not as a suitor but as a conqueror, with a warband of 50 warriors. His message was clear and brutal. He would claim Lagertha as his wife, whether her family consented or not. If they resisted, he would take her anyway and burn their lands as punishment for the insult. If they submitted peacefully, he would be satisfied with the marriage and leave their holdings intact. The household erupted into chaos. Lagertha's father's warriors numbered only 30, and many were away on seasonal trading missions. A direct battle would mean certain defeat. The conventional wisdom, voiced by her father's advisors and her own mother, was to negotiate, to find some compromise that would satisfy Fru's pride while protecting the household. Perhaps offer him a larger dowry. Perhaps arrange a longer engagement period during which they could seek allies. Perhaps submit to the marriage, but insist on terms that would protect Lagertha. These were the normal tools of Viking diplomacy, the ways that weaker parties navigated conflicts with stronger ones. But Lagertha had a different idea, one that horrified her family when she revealed it. That night, while the men argued politics and strategy in the Great Hall, while her mother wept and prayed to Freya for guidance, Lagertha went to the armory. She took a sword from the wall, not a practice weapon of wood, but a real blade of folded steel. She took a shield, round and reinforced with iron. She found leather armor that fit her reasonably well, taken from a younger warrior's equipment. She prepared herself as any warrior would before battle. When dawn came and Fru expected an answer, Lagertha walked out of the hall to face him. The sight stopped everyone cold. A 16-year-old girl, barely more than a child by Viking standards, armed and armored for battle, standing between two warbands. The morning mist swirled around her. The rising sun caught her golden hair, and in her hands, she held weapons of war as if they belonged there. Fru's first reaction was laughter. It was meant to be intimidating, mocking, to put this presumptuous girl in her place. But it came out nervous, uncertain. Something about the way she stood, the way she held that sword with absolute confidence. The way her eyes never wavered from his didn't match the mockery he was attempting. This wasn't the terrified girl he had expected. This was something else entirely, something he didn't have a reference point for. He told her to go back inside, to let the men handle this matter of marriage and politics. It was no concern of hers, he said, though he was literally trying to claim her as property. She didn't respond to his dismissal. Instead, she did something that made the blood drain from Fru's face. In a voice that carried across both warbands, clear and unwavering, she challenged him to holmgang. Single combat. A duel to determine the matter once and for all. The laughter died instantly. Holmgang was sacred in Norse culture, a formalized duel governed by strict rules and witnessed by both parties. It was often used to settle disputes that couldn't be resolved through negotiation. To issue a challenge was serious. To refuse a challenge was to be marked as a coward forever, to lose all honor and respect. But Fro found himself in an impossible position. If he accepted the challenge and won, he would be forever known as the man who needed a formal duel to defeat a 16-year-old girl. Every mead hall in Scandinavia would mock him. But if he refused, he would be marked as a coward who feared a child. And if he lost? But that was unthinkable. He was a veteran warrior, scarred from dozens of battles, trained since childhood in combat. She was a girl, untested in real battle, surely relying on shock value rather than actual skill. The outcome was certain. So, with the eyes of both warbands upon him, with his reputation on the line, Fro accepted the challenge. The holmgang would begin at noon, giving both parties time to prepare. What happened in the hours between dawn and noon became part of the legend. Lagertha sat calmly, eating a good meal, checking her equipment with the methodical care of a professional warrior. She showed no fear, no doubt, no hesitation. Meanwhile, Fru grew increasingly agitated. His bravado began to crack. He drank more than he should have. His hands shook slightly as he checked his weapons. For the first time in his brutal life, he was fighting an opponent he couldn't understand, and that uncertainty ate at his confidence. When noon arrived, the formal holmgang ground was prepared. A square marked with hazel poles, the sacred boundary within which the combat would take place. Both warbands formed a circle around this space. Witnesses from neutral parties were called to ensure the rules were followed. A priest of Odin blessed both combatants and declared that the gods would judge the outcome. The rules were stated clearly. Fight until one yielded, was disabled, or died. The victor's position in the dispute would be acknowledged as correct by divine judgment. They entered the holmgang ground from opposite sides. Fru was larger, heavier, with longer reach and greater raw strength. Lagertha was smaller, faster, moving with a grace that came from years of dedicated practice. They circled each other, and observers would later say that you could see the moment when Fru realized he might have made a terrible mistake. The way she moved wasn't the uncertain shuffling of an amateur. It was the controlled, efficient movement of someone who had trained intensively. Fru attacked first, trying to use his size advantage to overwhelm her quickly. A massive overhead strike that would have split her skull if it had connected. But it didn't connect. Lagertha wasn't where the strike landed. She had moved, not retreating but angling aside, letting his momentum carry him past her. She struck at his exposed side, a quick slash that drew first blood. Not a deep wound, but a message. She could hit him whenever she chose. He came at her again, more cautious now, trying to use his shield to crowd her, to force her back against the hazel poles where she would have no room to maneuver. But she didn't fight the way men fought. She didn't try to match his strength shield to shield. She used angles, footwork, staying mobile, striking from unexpected directions. Every time he committed to an attack, she was somewhere else, and his blade found only air. The fight continued for what felt like hours, but was actually less than 10 minutes. Fru was getting tired, frustrated, angry. Anger made him sloppy. Fatigue made him slow. And Lagertha, who had trained for this her entire life, who had prepared specifically for opponents who relied on strength over technique, was patient. She waited for her moment. It came when Fru overextended on a wild swing, putting too much force into it, gambling everything on one decisive blow. He lost his balance slightly, just for a moment. But a moment was enough. Lagertha's strike was precise, economical, perfect. Her sword caught him behind the knee, severing tendons. He went down hard, crashing into the mud. She could have killed him then. She stood over him, her sword at his throat, and tradition demanded she end it. The holmgang was to the death, or until one party yielded. But Lagertha did something more devastating, something that showed a political sophistication beyond her years. She offered him terms. He would live on the condition that he leave and never return, that he tell everyone exactly what happened here, that he spread the word far and wide that he, the mighty Jarl Fru, had been defeated in single combat by a girl he had tried to force into marriage. He accepted. He had no choice, and true to his word, he did tell everyone. Within weeks, the story had spread throughout Norway and beyond. A Shieldmaiden, they called her, using the old term from legends. A woman warrior. Some dismissed it as exaggeration, impossible tales. Others claimed it was blasphemy, a violation of natural order. But to young women throughout Scandinavia who had felt the same fire Lagertha felt, who had chafed against the restrictions placed on them, it was something else entirely. It was hope. It was permission. It was proof that another path existed. Lagertha's father, rather than being shamed by his daughter's unprecedented behavior, recognized the opportunity it presented. The story had made her famous throughout the Norse world. Fame, in Viking culture, was a form of currency as valuable as silver or land. Warriors began arriving at their hall, drawn by curiosity and fascination. Some came to challenge her, to prove that the story was exaggerated or false. She defeated them all, each victory adding to her growing legend. Others came to join her, women and even some men who believed in what she represented, or who simply saw her as a rising power worth attaching themselves to. Within a year of her duel with Fru, Lagertha commanded her own warband. It started small, perhaps a dozen warriors who followed her not because of her father's name or wealth, but because of her own skill and the vision she represented. This was unprecedented in Viking history. While there are scattered references throughout the Norse sagas to individual female warriors, a warband led by a woman and including multiple female warriors was revolutionary, a fundamental challenge to centuries of cultural assumption. Lagertha recruited carefully and with clear purpose. She sought warriors who were skilled, certainly, but more importantly, warriors who understood what she was trying to build. This wasn't just another raiding party seeking quick wealth. This was a statement that women could not only fight, but lead. That gender was not the determining factor in warrior capability. That the old assumptions could be challenged and defeated, just as she had defeated Fru. Among her earliest recruits were 3 women who would become legendary in their own right, whose names would be recorded in the sagas alongside Lagertha's own. There was Astrid, a farmer's daughter from the eastern valleys who had killed a man trying to rape her and fled her village rather than face the consequences. She arrived at Lagertha's hall with nothing but her father's old sword and a burning desire for a life where she would never be powerless again. There was Ingrid, the daughter of a minor jarl who had been promised in marriage to a man 3 times her age, a wealthy but brutal warrior who had beaten his previous wives to death. She chose exile and uncertainty over certain misery, arriving at Lagertha's hall after weeks of dangerous travel alone. And there was Thera, a widow whose husband had been killed in a raid, who took up his weapons and refused to remarry, instead seeking revenge on those who had made her a widow. Each of these women had a story of defiance, of refusing to accept what society had decreed as their proper role. These women, and others like them, formed the core of what later chroniclers would sometimes call the Shield Sisters, though Lagertha herself never used that term. To her, they were simply warriors. Their gender was secondary to their skill, their courage, their loyalty, and their willingness to stand together against a world that told them they shouldn't exist. Lagertha trained them personally, sharing everything her grandfather had taught her and everything she had learned through her own hard experience. She was demanding, pushing them harder than any male instructor would have dared, because she knew with absolute certainty that they would face skepticism and dismissal at every turn. They needed to be undeniable. They needed to be so skilled, so professional, so effective, that even the most hardened skeptic couldn't claim they were merely adequate. They had to be exceptional. The warband's first major raid was against a wealthy monastery on the Norwegian coast, a target carefully selected for multiple strategic reasons. Monasteries were common targets for Viking raids, holding treasure donated by the faithful and being notoriously poorly defended. But Lagertha's approach was radically different from typical Viking tactics. Where most raiding parties relied on surprise and overwhelming force, attacking with brutal speed and accepting whatever casualties resulted, Lagertha employed careful intelligence gathering and meticulous planning. She sent scouts ahead weeks before the raid, learning the monastery's routines and rhythms. She identified when the defenses were weakest, when guards changed, when supplies were delivered. She planned multiple escape routes in case things went wrong. She drilled her warband in the specific movements and actions required for this particular raid. When they finally struck, it was with surgical precision. They achieved complete surprise, encountered minimal resistance, secured their objectives quickly, and withdrew before any organized response could materialize. Not a single member of Lagertha's warband died or was seriously injured. The raid was a textbook example of professional military operation. The success brought wealth, which was important for maintaining a warband. Warriors needed to be fed, equipped, and compensated for their service. But more importantly, The success brought credibility. Lagertha had proven she could lead a successful military operation, that her warband was professional and effective, that her methods worked. More recruits came. Some were women, drawn by the possibility of a life beyond what society had prescribed for them. Others were men, warriors who saw Lagertha not as a novelty or curiosity, but as a skilled commander worth following. Her warband grew in size and capability, but commanding a warband required more than just fighting ability. It required resources, land, wealth, political connections. Lagertha began leading her warband on carefully selected raids, building a reputation and accumulating the capital necessary to sustain and grow her operations. She studied her targets obsessively, learning their weaknesses, planning her attacks for maximum gain and minimum risk. Her style of warfare was different from the traditional Viking approach of raid and pillage. Where others relied on overwhelming force and accepted high casualties as inevitable, she used intelligence, misdirection, timing, and precision. She won battles she had no business winning, against forces that outnumbered her 2 or 3 to 1, by being smarter and better prepared than her opponents. It was during one of these raids, a carefully planned strike against a rival Jarl's holdings in southern Norway, that she first encountered Ragnar Lothbrok. He was leading his own warband against the same target, operating independently but with similar objectives. They were, technically, competitors for the same spoils. The situation could easily have devolved into conflict between the two warbands. But when Ragnar saw Lagertha in battle, fighting like the Valkyries of legend made flesh, something fundamental shifted in his understanding of the world and his place in it. What happened next became one of the most famous courtships in Viking legend, a relationship that would challenge and ultimately reshape Norse assumptions about partnership and power. Ragnar didn't try to conquer Lagertha or claim her as a prize of battle. He didn't attempt to assert dominance or prove superiority. Instead, he did something that shocked his own warriors and intrigued Lagertha. He courted her as he would court a fellow Jarl, with respect and genuine acknowledgement of her achievements and status. He challenged her to contests of skill, not to prove superiority, but to find a worthy companion. They would spar with weapons, their bouts drawing crowds of warriors from both warbands who had never seen anything quite like it. They were evenly matched, each winning roughly as often as they lost. They traded stories of their battles and raids, each trying to top the other's tales. They debated strategy and tactics, arguing fiercely over the best approach to various military problems. They were rivals, yes, but also partners, colleagues, and something more that neither had quite experienced before. Their relationship defied every convention of Norse society regarding how men and women were supposed to interact, particularly in the context of courtship and marriage. When they finally decided to marry, it wasn't a transaction between families or an alliance of houses negotiated by elders and advisors. It was a partnership freely chosen between equals, two formidable warriors deciding to join forces and see what they could accomplish together. The marriage ceremony itself became legendary for its departure from tradition. Rather than the conventional ceremony where the bride was essentially transferred from her father's authority to her husband's, where she received the keys to his household and submitted to his headship, Lagertha and Ragnar created something entirely new. They exchanged swords instead of traditional vows, each swearing an oath not of obedience but of partnership. Each pledged to fight beside the other, to defend the other, to build something greater together than either could build alone. They swore as equals before the gods and their assembled warriors. Old women in the audience whispered that it was improper, that the gods would not bless such an unconventional union. But the gods, if they had opinions, seemed content to let Lagertha and Ragnar forge their own path. In the years that followed, Ragnar and Lagertha became the most formidable partnership in Scandinavia. A power couple whose combined capabilities exceeded what either could achieve individually. They complemented each other perfectly in ways that only became apparent through their joint operations. Ragnar was bold, innovative, willing to take risks that others wouldn't dare. He had a genius for seeing opportunities where others saw only obstacles. But he could also be impulsive, sometimes failing to consider all the consequences of his actions. Lagertha was his balance, the voice of strategic thinking that turned Ragnar's audacious ideas into achievable victories. She was methodical, thorough, considering every angle and potential complication before committing to action. In battle, they fought as one, each instinctively knowing where the other would be, what they would do, covering each other's vulnerabilities and amplifying each other's strengths. They developed a form of combined tactics that was unprecedented in Viking warfare. Ragnar might lead a frontal assault while Lagertha commanded a flanking force, or Lagertha would set an elaborate trap that Ragnar would drive enemies into. They communicated with glances and subtle gestures, coordinating complex maneuvers in the chaos of battle with a precision that amazed and intimidated their opponents. They conducted joint raids across Norway, Denmark, and even ventured into the Baltic regions, their combined reputation preceding them and often intimidating opponents into submission without battle. Stories of the warrior couple spread through every mead hall in Scandinavia. They weren't just successful, they were legendary, and their success fed on itself as more warriors sought to join their forces, as more regions paid tribute to avoid facing them, as their wealth and influence grew exponentially. Their domestic life was equally unconventional and equally successful in defying societal expectations. Lagertha continued to train daily, to lead raids, to command respect as a warrior even after becoming a wife. Ragnar never asked her to choose between family and warrior life, never suggested that marriage should domesticate her or limit her activities. Instead, they built a household that accommodated both partners' needs and ambitions. Their home became a gathering place for warriors, both male and female, a center of power and influence in the region. They had children together, continuing the line that had begun with such promise. A son named Friedleif, and daughters whose names the sagas have unfortunately not preserved, but who, according to the fragmentary records that survive, were raised to be as formidable as their mother, trained in both domestic arts and warrior skills. Lagertha's pregnancy and motherhood did nothing to diminish her warrior status. She fought while pregnant, her growing belly protected by specially made armor. She led raids while nursing, her children cared for by trusted members of her household. She commanded armies with children waiting at home, just as male warriors did. She shattered every expectation of what a Norse woman, what any woman could be and do. For several years, this partnership thrived and grew stronger. Ragnar and Lagertha conquered together, accumulating wealth, land, reputation, and political influence. They seemed unstoppable, a perfect union of complementary strengths. But Ragnar's ambitions were growing beyond even what Lagertha had imagined possible. He began speaking of England, of lands across the Western Sea that he had heard about from traders and travelers. He talked of achievements that would make him immortal in legend, of doing what no Viking had done before, of building an empire that would span seas and reshape the world. And as his dreams expanded beyond Scandinavia's familiar shores, something in their relationship began to strain under the weight of conflicting visions and incompatible paths. The first cracks appeared when Ragnar began taking other wives, a common practice among Viking leaders seeking to forge political alliances through marriage. Each new wife came with her own family connections, her own territory, her own political advantages. In the brutal calculus of Viking politics, this made perfect sense. Multiple marriages meant multiple alliances, broader influence, greater stability. Most Viking women of noble birth accepted this reality, understanding that marriage was as much political tool as personal relationship. But for Lagertha, who had built her entire life on being recognized as an equal, on refusing to be just another woman in someone's household, on demanding respect and recognition for her own achievements, this arrangement was fundamentally unacceptable. She hadn't fought her way to warrior status, hadn't defied all of society's expectations, hadn't proven herself in countless battles, just to become one wife among many. Even if that man was Ragnar Lothbrok, even if she would technically be the first wife with certain privileges and status, the principle was intolerable. She demanded exclusive partnership or none at all. The sources differ on the exact details of their separation, and likely the truth involves elements from multiple accounts. Some sagas say Lagertha left by choice, refusing to share power or status with other women, unwilling to compromise her principles even for Ragnar. Others claim Ragnar divorced her to marry Thora, daughter of a Swedish king, choosing political advantage over personal connection. Still, others suggest the separation was mutual, both recognizing that their paths were diverging in ways that no amount of love or respect could reconcile. But whatever the specific sequence of events, the outcome was the same. Lagertha returned to Norway, to her own lands and her own power base, and what happened next would prove definitively that she had never needed Ragnar to be extraordinary. Back in Norway, Lagertha faced immediate challenges from jarls and warriors who had assumed that her power derived from her association with Ragnar Lothbrok. They saw her separation from the most famous Viking of the age as an opportunity to expand their own territories at her expense. They assumed that without Ragnar's support and reputation, she would be vulnerable, perhaps even desperate for new alliances and willing to make concessions to secure her position. They assumed wrong, and they would pay dearly for their miscalculation. Lagertha defended her lands with the same tactical genius and warrior skills she had always possessed. The same capabilities that had made her legendary long before she ever met Ragnar. She not only repelled the attacks, but turned them into opportunities for expansion. Each failed assault on her territory resulted in her forces counterattacking and claiming the defeated Jarl's holdings. Within a few years, she had transformed from a warrior woman married to a famous man into something far more dangerous and independent. A ruler in her own right, controlling significant territory through a combination of military might and political acumen. The sagas preserve a moment that perfectly encapsulates everything Lagertha was and everything she represented. A rival jarl, commanding a force that outnumbered her warriors 3-1, sent a messenger to demand her surrender. He offered terms that he clearly considered generous. Submit to his rule, acknowledge him as her overlord, and he would allow her to keep her life and even retain some of her lands. If she would agree to marry him, she could maintain significant status as his wife, keeping much of her wealth and position. The messenger delivered this offer expecting negotiation, perhaps some back and forth as Lagertha tried to extract better terms. Lagertha's response became legendary. She told the messenger to return to his master with a simple message. She would meet him on the battlefield at dawn. He should bring his best warriors because they would all die there. The messenger, shocked by the defiance, asked if she understood that she was outnumbered 3-1. Lagertha replied that numbers matter less than skill, and she had more skill in one hand than his master had in his entire army. She told him to deliver the message exactly as spoken, and to advise his master to make peace with whatever gods he favored, because tomorrow he would meet them. The next morning, that jarl learned what countless others had learned, and what future enemies would continue to learn. Lagertha didn't make idle threats, and she didn't bluff. The battle was decisive, brutal, and ended with Lagertha standing over her defeated enemy. She claimed his lands, his wealth, and his reputation. She didn't just win battles. She annihilated opponents so thoroughly that others thought very carefully before challenging her. But Lagertha's greatest test, the battle that would define her legacy and secure her place in history, came from an unexpected quarter. A civil war within her own homeland. Multiple jarls and petty kings fought for regional dominance in a conflict that threatened to tear Norway apart. Her own father found himself on one side of this conflict, allied with several other jarls against a coalition of enemies who sought to reshape the political map of their region. The odds were not in her father's favor. His alliance was outnumbered and outmaneuvered, facing what appeared to be inevitable defeat. Despite their complicated past, despite every time her father had tried to force her into a conventional life, despite the arguments and conflicts over her choice to become a warrior, Lagertha gathered her forces and came to his aid. Family loyalty ran deep in Viking culture, and whatever their disagreements, he was still her father. More practically, his defeat would destabilize the entire region, potentially threatening her own holdings. And perhaps, in a deeper way, she saw an opportunity to prove once and for all that the daughter who defied him had become far more valuable than any conventional marriage alliance could have been. The Battle of Hlaðir, as it came to be known in the sagas and historical records, was one of the largest conflicts in Norwegian history up to that point. Thousands of warriors from dozens of different jarls and their holdings converged on a single battlefield in what is now the Trøndelag region. The scale was unprecedented. Entire family lines would be wiped out. The political map of Norway would be redrawn. The outcome would shape the region's future for generations. Lagertha arrived with her warband, a force of several hundred warriors, smaller than many of the armies already assembled, but possessing something most of them lacked: professional discipline and a commander of genius. Her very arrival affected morale on both sides in measurable ways. Her allies were emboldened by the presence of the legendary Shieldmaiden. Her enemies were unsettled, having heard the stories and now facing the reality of Lagertha in battle. Before the battle began, Lagertha conducted a tactical assessment that demonstrated why she had survived and thrived in the brutal world of Viking warfare. She personally surveyed the terrain, noting every hill and depression, every patch of forest, every stream and marshy area. She studied where the sun would be at different times of day, how visibility would change, how shadows would shift. She considered ground conditions, identifying areas that would become muddy and treacherous once trampled by thousands of feet, areas that would favor defenders or attackers. Nothing was too small to notice or too minor to factor into her planning. She positioned her forces not in the traditional massed shield wall that most Viking armies employed, a formation that was strong but inflexible, capable of powerful forward momentum but vulnerable to flanking or to having its cohesion broken. Instead, she created a more flexible arrangement, organizing her warriors into smaller units that could respond independently to changing battlefield conditions while still supporting each other. She kept reserves hidden in nearby forests, positioned to respond to emerging threats or exploit unexpected opportunities. She established complex signaling systems using horn blasts and banner movements, allowing her to coordinate different sections of the army even in the chaos of large-scale battle. When the enemy forces arrived, their commanders confident in their numerical superiority, they found themselves facing an army that was smaller but far better organized and more intelligently deployed. Lagertha let them advance initially, let them commit to their attack plan, let them believe they were winning. And then she sprang multiple traps simultaneously, showing a level of coordination and tactical sophistication that shocked veteran warriors who had fought in dozens of battles. The reserves she had hidden emerged from unexpected directions, striking at vulnerable points in the enemy formation. The flexible positioning of her forward units allowed them to wheel and maneuver in ways that rigid shield walls couldn't match, enveloping and isolating sections of the enemy army. What should have been a straightforward, if brutal grinding match became a nightmare of confusion and encirclement for the enemy commanders, who found their superior numbers turned against them as their own forces became obstacles to each other. The battle raged for hours, a chaotic melee of shield walls smashing together, individual combats erupting across the field, tactical maneuvers and desperate last stands playing out simultaneously across the vast battlefield. The ground became muddy with blood. The air filled with the sounds of clashing weapons, screaming men, and the commands of leaders trying to maintain control of their forces. It was hell made manifest, war in its most raw and brutal form. And through it all, Lagertha was everywhere, leading charges at critical points, shoring up defensive lines that were about to break, appearing at crucial moments when one section of the Allied army was about to collapse. Warriors who survived the battle would speak of seeing her with golden hair flying behind her like a banner, her shield split from repeated impacts but still functional, her sword red with the blood of enemies, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade as she rallied warriors to stand and fight. At one critical moment, when the center of the Allied formation was about to collapse under sustained enemy pressure, when it seemed the entire battle might be lost in a cascading rout, Lagertha personally led a counterattack that not only stopped the enemy advance, but pushed them back. She fought at the very front of the formation, her presence and her courage inspiring the warriors around her to fight beyond their normal limits. to push past exhaustion and fear and match her example. When an enemy champion, a jarl known for his prowess in single combat, challenged her in the midst of the larger battle, she accepted without hesitation, defeated him in minutes, and then used his death to further demoralize the enemy forces. When the battle finally ended, when the enemy forces broke and fled, leaving thousands of dead and dying scattered across the bloodied ground, it was Lagertha's tactical decisions, her personal courage, and her ability to inspire and lead that had turned a battle that should have been lost into a decisive victory. Her father, humbled and grateful, offered her a position of high honor in his household, recognition of her achievements, and an attempt at reconciliation. She declined politely but firmly. She had her own lands to govern, her own destiny to fulfill, her own legend to build. She had proven her point. The daughter who defied him had become far more valuable than any conventional marriage alliance. But fate, it seemed, wasn't finished with Lagertha and Ragnar Lothbrok. Years after their separation, after both had built independent legends and reputations, Ragnar found himself in serious trouble. A rival king named Eystein had invaded Ragnar's territory while he was away on a distant raid. Ragnar's forces were scattered, his position vulnerable, his normally overwhelming military superiority temporarily neutralized by unfortunate timing, and Eystein's opportunistic assault. Ragnar needed allies desperately, and he needed them quickly. After considering his options, he swallowed his considerable pride and sent messengers to Norway, to Lagertha, asking for her help. The messengers found her ruling her kingdom with wisdom and strength, respected and feared in equal measure. They delivered Ragnar's request and waited for her response. Lagertha's advisors urged her to refuse. Ragnar had abandoned her, they argued. He had taken other wives, built his legend without her, made clear that he didn't need her partnership. She owed him nothing. Helping him would only validate his choices and make her seem like she had been waiting all this time for his attention. Better to let him face the consequences of his decisions and solve his own problems. But Lagertha saw the situation differently, with a strategic clarity that her advisors lacked. This wasn't about Ragnar's ego or their complicated personal history. This was an opportunity to prove, decisively and publicly, something that needed proving. She didn't need Ragnar Lothbrok, but he very much needed her. Helping him now, on her terms and with her resources, would demonstrate beyond any possible doubt that she had built real power independent of their relationship. She agreed to help, but she set the conditions. She arrived in Denmark with a fleet of longships and a military force that stunned everyone who saw it. She hadn't brought a token force to save face or fulfill some minimum obligation. She had brought a full army, evidence of the substantial power she had accumulated in the years since leaving Ragnar. The size and professional quality of her forces made a statement that words never could. She was a major power in her own right, not some dependent seeking to restore a lost relationship. When the combined forces met King Eystein in battle, it was Lagertha's tactical genius that secured the victory. She commanded one wing of the army, executed a complex flanking maneuver that required perfect timing and coordination, trapped the enemy between two forces, and personally led the charge that broke their lines and turned the battle from a hard-fought contest into a rout. Ragnar, fighting on the other wing, was crucial to the victory. But everyone who witnessed the battle understood that Lagertha had been the decisive factor. After the battle, Ragnar, grateful and perhaps finally realizing the magnitude of what he had lost, asked Lagertha to stay, to return to their marriage, to rule beside him, to rebuild what they had once shared. It was probably the closest Ragnar ever came to admitting a mistake, and it showed a vulnerability he rarely displayed. But Lagertha had changed fundamentally since their separation. She was no longer the young warrior seeking partnership with a famous man. She was a queen in her own right, a legendary warrior, a ruler of significant territories. She had proven beyond any doubt that she could not only survive without Ragnar, but could thrive, could build something impressive entirely on her own merits. She declined his offer with grace but firmness. She would always remember what they had shared, she told him. She respected him and wished him well. But she had her own kingdom to govern, her own people to protect, her own destiny to pursue. She had proven she could live without him. Now he knew it too, not as an abstract concept, but as a witnessed reality. She returned to Norway, leaving Ragnar to contemplate what he had given up in pursuit of his expanding ambitions. Back in her own kingdom, Lagertha faced what would be her final great military challenge. A young earl, ambitious and ruthless, decided that an aging warrior queen was vulnerable to conquest. He saw Lagertha, now in her 40s and showing the first signs of the years of hard campaigning, and assumed her best fighting days were behind her. He raised a substantial army, forged alliances with neighboring jarls, and prepared for an invasion, confident that he could defeat her and claim her lands. What this young earl failed to understand, what many people throughout history have failed to understand, is that Lagertha's greatest weapon was never her physical strength or her sword arm. It was her mind. And minds don't age the way bodies do. If anything, experience and wisdom make tactical thinking sharper, not duller. Lagertha allowed the earl to invade. She pulled her forces back strategically, giving ground, making him think he was winning. He pursued confidently, growing bolder with each small victory, stretching his supply lines deeper into her territory, becoming overconfident in his apparent success. His advisors warned him that the ease of his advance was suspicious, that Lagertha was too smart to simply collapse without resistance. He dismissed their concerns, convinced that her reputation was based on past glories and that age had diminished her capabilities. And then, when he was far from his own territory, deep in hers, with supply lines stretched thin and his forces scattered across multiple positions trying to hold his conquests, Lagertha sprang the trap. Forces she had hidden emerged from forests and hills. Supply lines were cut simultaneously at multiple points. Escape routes were blocked. In a single day of perfectly coordinated attacks, she destroyed an army that had outnumbered her own forces significantly, demonstrating that tactical genius trumps numerical superiority. The young earl, captured and brought before Lagertha, expected to be executed as a defeated enemy and cautionary tale. Instead, she offered him a choice that demonstrated both her strategic wisdom and her understanding of how to build lasting power. He could swear loyalty to her, acknowledge her as his superior, and live to serve in her army with a chance to rebuild his reputation through loyal service. Or he could refuse and die on the battlefield where he was captured, remembered only as another fool who underestimated Lagertha. He chose life and loyalty, and Lagertha gained not just victory in battle, but a devoted follower who would spend the rest of his life telling everyone the story of how completely she had outmaneuvered him. Lagertha's final years are shrouded in the mystery and legend that often obscures the end of remarkable lives. The historical sources become sparse and contradictory. Some sagas say she eventually retired from active warfare, that she ruled her lands with wisdom until dying peacefully in old age, surrounded by grandchildren and respected by all. Other accounts claim she was killed by a jealous rival who struck her down when age had finally weakened her. A tragic end for a warrior who had survived so many battles. Still, others insist she died in battle as any true warrior should, fighting to her last breath against enemies who finally caught her without her usual advantages. But the truth of how she died matters less than the truth of how she lived. And that truth is undeniable. Lagertha proved that women could fight, could lead, could rule, could be just as formidable as any man. Every Shieldmaiden who came after her, every woman who refused to accept the limitations society tried to impose, carried a piece of Lagertha's legacy with them. She didn't just fight for herself. She fought for a principle, for an idea, for the revolutionary concept that capability mattered more than gender. If you enjoyed this epic saga of the woman who redefined what strength means, make sure to subscribe to Viking Valhalla for more untold stories of the greatest warriors history has ever known. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another legendary tale. Which Viking legend should we explore next? Bjorn Ironside's Mediterranean voyages? Fridas Eriksdottir's American expedition? Harold Hardrada's quest for power? Your voice shapes our sagas. Until next time, may your spirit be fierce and your courage unbreakable. Skål.